Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.deborahrrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. It is that time of year again. Yes, time to clean the vendor master file. And stick around to the end because I'll tell you where you can spend 30 minutes and get some great resources and tools to help with the process. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 208. It's time to clean your vendor master file, updated for 2022. So every year I do the same podcast around the same time. I think it might be a little earlier this year about how to clean your vendor master file. And I give the steps and I update it based on whatever's gone on throughout the year. And so I do have a couple of updates for 2022. Now, most of you, if you have been around listening to my podcast for a while, you know that I previously was an accounts payable senior manager. I was responsible for over 140,000 active vendor records across, between 5 and 7 ERPs, depending on, if I was in between mergers and acquisitions. But October and November was always go time. And I did have a process in place where the vendor master files were to be cleaned for each of those on a monthly basis. But this was the time that if it wasn't done for whatever reason, or there were any issues that had not been resolved yet, like vendor validations that weren't done or that weren't successful, and they weren't able to contact the vendor. This was really go time where we had to make decisions. And so October, November was it. And it actually started like September, October, depending on when the IRS issued their publication 1220. Because at that point, we identify what changes need to be made in our ERPs to comply with that year's 1099 form. And at that time, for us, it was the 1099 MISC. But for you, it may be the 1099 MISC and the 1099 NEC form. Now, we had to do this because we had the 1099 MISC embedded in a couple of our ERPs. And so we needed to make sure that we waited on publication 1220 to see how we needed to update the forms that were embedded in the accounting system or ERPs. And then also whatever updates were required for the file that we generated in the accounting system or ERPs that we uploaded to IRS's FIRE system. And then, of course, we had to make sure that we were ready to test and then test in the FIRE system before that went offline. It was just a lot to do in that time period. And it's not just the IRS and the federal reporting, it's also state reporting as well. Both the state and federal reporting requires accurate vendor master file data, and that is the legal name and tax ID combination. So if you want to avoid penalties for correction filings and avoid subsequent team member non-value added work, right? Going through the B notice when you have to reach out to these vendors because the legal name and tax ID combination didn't match. So you don't want to go through that. You don't want to pay, have correction filings and risk penalties from the IRS. And then also the addresses. You want to make sure that when you send out your 1099 MISC and 1099 NEC and any other 1099 forms that you send to these vendors, that you're not going to get them back because the addresses were not valid. And that is a lot of rework when you get those back, because you have to retain them, which means you have to get them in. We used to log them, and then we would upload them to the vendor record as support. And then comes the other real work with identifying the correct address and then resending it. So legal name and tax ID combination and addresses were really the key pieces that you need for state reporting. But don't get me wrong, the cleaning up the vendor master file is not all about cleaning it up just for state and federal reporting. It still needs to remain active to avoid fraud, fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So let's talk about an 8-step process to clean your vendor master file. And again, I recommend that these are done on a monthly basis. We used to do that when I was a practitioner, but I did have a lot of staff. I had 17 vendor team members, and that may seem like a lot, and it really was. However, we also had, if you remember, 140,000 active vendor records across 5 to 7 ERPs. And I will tell you, no one wanted the job of cleaning the vendor master file, nor being the backup for someone else, because it's mostly a manual process. And you'll see that as we walk through it. All right, so 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. So the first step is inactivate vendors that have not had activity in 15, 18, or 24 months. And what I'm really talking about is activity across at least 4 areas. So that's purchase order activity, invoice activity, payment activity, and then also take a look at the last modified date, or whatever that field is called, when you update the vendor record. Because one of the big points is to make sure that they have updated information, because you don't want that information being stale. You also want to make sure that you don't have vendors that you haven't used in a long time just out and open and active, that because at that point they are susceptible to both internal and external fraud. So you want to make sure you inactivate your vendors, and you can pick what the inactivity threshold is, 15, 18, or 24 months. The less months you do, the less active vendors, which is always good for fraud. But you don't want to go to 12 because you probably have some annual vendor payments you have to make. But 15, 18, or 24 usually works well. And 24 months is probably what I see most often. Now, once you've inactivated your vendors, and you do want to do that first because that reduces the number of vendors that you have to take through the remaining 7 steps. All right, so step 2 is the IRS 10 match. And I say IRS 10 match as opposed to any of the other countries because, again, this is what is required for IRS reporting, right? That legal name, tax ID combination. You do want to make sure it's valid. If you're sending out 1099s, if you're sending out 1042s, yes. And I didn't mention 1042s, but there are, you've got to send those out as well. And some of those foreign vendors or non-US vendors do have tax IDs. So it's both the US and non-US or foreign payees, and it's also for the 1042s in addition to the 1099s. All right, step 3 is the address status and standardization. And yes, I did say status. So the standardization, making sure it's formatted correctly, really helps to ensure that your mailed forms, 1099s, 1042s, will not be delayed and won't come back. But another piece of that is the status. So there is a resource that I'll talk about upcoming that will allow you to check the status of the address. And that means that it'll tell you if the address is mailable. But not only that, it'll tell you if the address is vacant, if it's inactive, or if it's a P.O. box only. And P.O. box only really doesn't have a lot to do with the 1099 forms, but it can be a great way to identify a potential red flag for fraud, because sometimes P.O. box onlys can be used by fraudulent or fraudsters or cyber criminals to hide the fact that, they are a fraudster because they don't have a physical address. And so if you do have vendors that do not have a physical address, then you want to make sure you collect one. Now, with the inactivation of vendor records, which really doesn't have a lot to do with the reporting side, but with the inactivation of vendor records, with the IRS 10 match being done, with the address status and standardization being done, you really could stop at step 3 if all you're doing is getting ready for the 1099 or the 1042 filings season. But I recommend, and you knew I would, continuing through the remaining steps. And the remaining steps are primarily validations, which means that you can do them in any order. So step 4, 5, 6, and 7 is, you can do these in whatever order you have them, you want to do them in. But I put them in this specific order. Doesn't mean you can't change it around. So step 4 is validating bank details. So this means validating bank branch details, because the routing numbers can change as banks merge and are acquired. And that does happen very often. And vendors never seem to tell you that. You only find that out when you send a pay file with the old routing number in there, and then you get a notification back to say that they either changed it so that payment can be successful, or they didn't change it and they sent the payment back as not being successful, right? The payment failed. So you do want to make sure you check that. The good news is that many of your vendors will share the same bank. So if you update the routing number or the bank branch details for one, you can do it for multiple vendors at the same time. The bad news is I don't know any resource that will let you do a bulk upload of bank routing numbers. So we'll talk about some resources for that. But the other piece of the validating banking details is the bank ownership validation. So validating that your vendor actually does own, right, does have, or is connected to that account, to make sure that you're eliminating fraud. And so if you have a subscription, if you're able to do that, I would do that at the time that you do your vendor master file cleanups, although I'll leave that piece up to you, because I think those services charge based on the volume of the number of lookups. And then also, if you are using those and if you are able to do a bulk upload, shoot me an email or comment on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast on, because I'd love to hear that. I don't know if they have the ability to do a bulk upload. I think they do, but I've never known anyone that actually has used it. So if you do have the ability to do bank account ownership validation, this is a great time to verify or to make sure that no fraudulent banking information has made it into your vendor master file. The next one, step 5, is validate your vendors and your vendor's bank against the OFAC or their consolidated list. So you want to confirm that your existing vendors have not been added to watch lists post vendor setup or the last time you checked. And I will tell you that the OFAC came out, or I saw it either as an alert somewhere, or maybe it was in some type of an article or press release, that the OFAC watch lists, their consolidated lists, have grown since the Russian invasion on Ukraine. So those lists were never static anyway. That's why, you need to keep checking. But especially now, if you haven't verified or validated your vendors aren't on those watch lists in a while, it's time to do that. And you also need to check foreign financial institutions as well, because the OFAC has a capital list, and I don't know what the acronym is for it, but but they have a capital list, and that capital list has foreign financial institutions that you are not allowed to pay. So you want to check that as well. Make sure you check your foreign financial institutions that you have in your vendor master file. Check those against OFAC along with all of your vendor legal names. All right, the next one is step 6, and that is to validate tax registration numbers for international, non-US, foreign vendors. And those are things like confirming the VAT numbers are still active for vendors in countries that use a VAT, like the UK. Maybe the business number for your vendors that are in Canada, maybe your GST numbers, right? Your goods and services tax numbers for your vendors that are in India, and really any other applicable registration numbers for vendors in other countries. They do have them out there, right? It's not all about the IRS tax ID. There are other registration numbers or vendor registration numbers that you need to collect at vendor setup, and then also continue to verify that they remain valid. And it may not be needed, right, for the IRS 1042 forms, right, for the distribution and the filing, but it could help other groups in your country, or not your country, in your company, such as the tax teams, right, that may have to report on taxes paid in order to reclaim them. So this is a great time to check those non-US, non-IRS tax ID or registration numbers for your international, foreign, or non-US vendors. Okay, now step 7 is really a catch-all. This is where you validate other regulatory or other parties that might be unique to your industry or your company. So whatever validations that you currently do that I did not mention, lump them into step 7. So this can be those validations for things that you might get off of Dun & Bradstreet, such as creditworthiness, or maybe you're using Dun & Bradstreet's hierarchy so that you can do parent reporting, right? So you can do supplier reporting at a higher level. Or maybe you are a healthcare organization, or you receive federal funds, so you may need to add in the Office of Inspector General, OIG, their exclusion list, or the System of Award Management, SAM, their exclusion list, because if you are receiving federal funds, you are not to pay vendors that are on those exclusion lists. So you would need to add those in and include any documents that you collect, such as insurance certificates. Not quite sure. I've kind of never done that when I've dealt with vendors. But if you do, then you can include that in this step. And I don't quite know what the timing would be for that. But if you are performing this on a regular basis, add it to whatever time period is works for the collection of those insurance certificates. All right, so the next step, which is the last step, step 8, analyzing vendor records. This is where you take all of those validations for all of the vendors. You should have one master working Excel or Google Sheets file, but you take all of that information and you start to analyze those vendor records. So what you're doing here is you're researching duplicate vendors, you're adding missing information such as emails. And I do have a podcast episode 146 on 9 ways to collect missing vendor email addresses. And so if you need that, go ahead and listen to episode 146. And that can really help you if you are trying to deliver your vendor 1099s as electronic statements or electronically. And so you do need the email addresses for that. So this is a great time to review the missing data, to identify those vendors that did not pass validations. And for those vendors that did not pass validations, you'll want to send them emails, and whatever they didn't pass, make sure that you are requiring the same data or the same forms that you require for them to be collected in the first place. So a long way to say, if you require a W-9 and you should, when you're setting up vendors, if they're 10 match came back and it was not successful, require a W-9 to be submitted in order to update their information. Same thing with banking information, not necessarily the routing numbers, because you can just update that. But if you do have access to do the bank account ownership validation and it failed, then send them a vendor banking form. It should be a company branded ACH form. That's my recommendation, and have them complete that and send it to you. All right, so you're following up on vendors that have either missing information or failed validations. The other thing that you do here is you're checking for duplicate vendors, and make sure you're checking at least 3 ways. You're checking based on tax ID, based on vendor legal name, and then also based on address. And the address may be a little bit easier to find duplicate vendors now because you have standardized and formatted all of your addresses. And so it might be easier to find duplicates. Now, I do want to say with duplicate vendors, it can be a touchy subject because depending on your accounting system or ERP, you may be required to set up multiple vendors with the same tax ID. For example, if you have multiple addresses, or if you have a different payment method, and that could even be true where you have systems that have you don't need to have a different vendor record for additional addresses, but you may need to have an additional address or additional payment location if they have a different remit address for check payments, if they have if they want to be paid by a different payment method, if they want to be paid in a different currency. I know systems out there are all different, but you do need to make sure that you find a way for your system to identify duplicates. And one example that I'd like to give is I did a vendor master file cleanup for a client that had Oracle. And as you know, Oracle has site IDs, and I don't remember the version of it, but I think it was the online version. But in any event, Oracle has site IDs, and they have multiple site IDs per vendor record. And so you also want to check for duplicates at the address level if that's applicable for your accounting system or ERP, and it is for Oracle. So I checked the site ID, but you could have different sites for the same address if there's a different payment method and if there is a different currency. And so what I did is I concatenated those fields that are valid to be different. And then I use that concatenated field, if I'm saying that right, as the way to find the duplicate. So find a way to identify duplicates in your ERP, whatever that's like. And I know a lot of you out there use SAP and the partnering and the relationships. And so find a way in your system that you need to find duplicates. And once you do find the duplicates, keep in mind that you need to identify, one, if it's truly a valid duplicate, vendor record or records? And then if so, which one is going to survive? And the ones that are not going to survive, if they have open POs, pending invoices, anything that's outstanding, you probably won't be able to inactivate it anyway until you move that to the vendor record that is going to survive. So you do have some work to do in step 8. Yes, it's the last step, but it's the one that probably takes the longest. And not because you have to find the duplicates, but because you're waiting on these vendors to follow up with you, right? You've reached out to them to request information so that you can update your records when those validations failed or if you're missing data, and they just don't respond in the timely basis. I will say that one of my recommendations, and we used to do this, but we couldn't do it with all vendors, is to put an expiration date or a deadline date on the vendor record. Now, this may need to be case by case because some of your vendors might be strategic vendors. You may not be able to do that. But if you think about it, right, if you have a remittance address for a check payment, and yes, I know we also have check payments, but if you have a remittance address that is showing a status of vacant, you definitely do not want to send a payment to that vendor. So at some point you have to determine, it could be on a case by case basis, if you're going to put that vendor record on hold, if you are going to inactivate that vendor record because the information is not valid. You do need to decide that as a part of this step. But waiting for the vendors to send that information back is probably the longest piece of it. And I get people asking me all the time how long this process takes. And one time I said 3 weeks, and I could just hear the silent gasp because, again, I am recommending that you do this process on a monthly basis. And if it takes 3 weeks, and heck, you're almost hiring like one person just to do that. So to clarify, that 3 weeks is if you haven't done your vendor master file cleanup like all year, or maybe ever, right? Maybe you inherited the vendor master file and now you've got to go through and do this cleanup. But once you get in the groove of doing it, and the more often you do it, the less time it's going to take you, because the less issues you're going to have, you would have resolved each one as they came up on a monthly basis, right? If you did it on a monthly basis. So typically doing it on a monthly basis, it probably takes about 2 to 3 days to do the validations, right? To do the validations and to create that master file with the validations that you now need to review in step 8. The rest of the piece is really reviewing it and then reaching out to the vendors. And that part will probably take the rest of the week. So I would say a week's time where they're kind of almost 90% dedicated to this vendor master file cleanup. And then the other weeks of the month, you are waiting on follow-up information from the vendors that you reached out to because information was missing or the validations weren't correct. So my answer to that is it'll take about 1 week of dedicated time, again, depending on how often you do it. And then the rest of the time is waiting for and then following back up with those vendors that you reached out to get that updated information. So those were the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. Now, as I promised, it's time to talk about where you can get updated resources and tools to help you with those validations. Now, I have a vendor validation reference list, and this is a free download. If you go to my site, I'll put a link in the show notes. And for those of you that have already downloaded it, you'll want to download it again because it's been updated with additional references and links out to those references. So on this validation reference list, I have 26 different references or resources with the links that you can use to do the IRS 10 match, to do the address status and standardization. It's a company called Smarty. I also have links to where you can validate the routing numbers for US, for Canada, and then also for those non-US or international countries that do not use an IBAN. So make sure you download that for some references or some resources to do your validations. And then I have a webinar coming up on December 8th, and I know that's a ways away, but it's called Vendor Master File Cleanup Tools, Validate Vendor Data, Find Missing Vendor Data, and Identify Duplicates. So I'll have some tools, including I may end up doing a demo. I don't know, because I'm only doing it for 30 minutes and I want to make sure I get everything in there, because there are some new tools out there that will do things that you're looking for now, such as identifying those diverse vendors that are in your vendor master file. There's a resource to find vendor or global vendor registration numbers for 100 plus countries. There is a resource to check for just missing information that came out of that financial crisis of 2008. Now, some of these things are on the vendor validation list and some of them are not. I have an Excel add-in that I'll talk about to help you find duplicates, and I'll try to demo that like I did before. I've had this webinar on, I think back in 2020, but we have updates, but I'll try to demo the fuzzy match on an Excel add-in so you can see how you can find those duplicate vendors based on legal name, but it doesn't sort right when you do a sort. So this would be like if you had a vendor called Cafe, or let's say Pizza Parlor, but someone else put it in as the Pizza Parlor. If you sorted it, it would never come up, but it will come up with this fuzzy match add-in. And so I'll try to demo that as well. So I will have a link to that webinar in the show notes. So make sure you register if you are interested. All right, so a longer podcast today, but I hope you got some great information to take back. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 208th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.